Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about World of Warcraft Shadowlands and why it's broken. What are the major issues that the game on retail has right now? But before I get into that, I do want to talk about some of the things that Shadowlands does very well and some not necessarily quite as well, but are still okay. So first off, Mythic Dungeons and raiding. Nathria is a pretty amazing raid, or at least feels like it when you first enter it. It pretty much blew me away. It felt like an epic place to go to, like a grand adventure just awaited me around the corner. That's how I felt when I first entered Nathria. And although it's not quite as large or grand as it could have been, it still gives you a very positive feeling, and it's how a raid should feel as. As for the dungeons, fairly solid gameplay, many interesting bosses, many interesting encounters, and for the most part, pretty well done. For the most part. Necrotic Wake is pretty horrible. Plaguefall is irritating, same with Mists of Terran Scythe, but for the most part, the dungeons are fairly solid and well done. And there's some very good gameplay. Class-wise, pretty solid again. Though the balance in the game in general, not just with classes, but overall the balance in terms of dungeons or classes has been all over the place. I don't think I've seen as many sweeping changes balance-wise at any other point in the history of the game. When you see 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% nerfs or buffs, it gets pretty crazy. Or 40% though with certain boss, like 40% damage reduction, it's kind of ridiculous. And I think that's something that has happened because even though Shadowlands was delayed, they probably still didn't have all the time that they needed to actually finish it. Blame the pandemic. That's what I think about it. And certainly some tuning was required to get the game where it needed to be. But overall, fairly solid experience, fairly solid gameplay. Some things are disappointing. I'd say the Maw in Torghast had a lot of potential to be very interesting to play through, but it ended up being fairly boring. And that's not because the gameplay in those places is bad, but that's because the reward structure, the reward incentives just aren't there. You're only doing the Maw for the sake of a reputation. You're only really doing Torghast either for a mount to use in the Maw or for the sake of legendary currency. That's not really compelling enough, and after a couple hours it gets really boring and really grindy. But thankfully, although the journey is pretty terrible, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The tunnel itself is not great. It's atrocious to deal with, grinding the reputation with Venari or doing Torghast. Pretty terrible, pretty atrocious, but at least you know there is an end in sight from the very start. And that is a really, really good thing. Unlike previous versions of the game, specifically Legion or BFA, where you had an endless grind to go through with artifact power, and then you also had issues with loot, issues with Titan Forging and War Forging, which is no longer the case in Shadowlands. And that is probably one of the best things that they've actually done with Shadowlands, that they abandoned a pretty terrible system, a pretty bad system that they had put in place in Legion, which was highly detrimental to the game and its community. They decided to remove that. There is still randomized gear, and there's still a pretty atrocious grind to deal with, but as I said, there is an end in sight. And with randomized gear, it's nowhere near as important as Titan Forging or War Forging were, or as horrible as those systems could be. You can no longer get best in slot items from doing a world quest. That's no longer the case right now in World of Warcraft. It's a shame it took Blizzard so much time to entire expansions pretty much for them to figure out that these systems were not great. And they were really detrimental to BFA because Legion had many things going for it. The epic storyline, the conclusion of an epic storyline that had started in Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos was concluded with Legion, with Illidan, with Sargeras. It had that going for it. It had that appeal. BFA didn't. BFA had all the issues of Legion, but none of the good qualities of it, and it ended up being a dismal failure. But either way, Blizzard has certainly turned the page. And on a narrative standpoint, by distancing themselves from Azeroth and creating basically an entire new universe with the Shadowlands, this entire new settings, they've been able to go in different directions with the storyline. Now, I'm not saying it's great. There's still plenty of issues with the story, and I think the Carrion storyline is not that interesting. It's pretty dreadful, actually. The Ardenweald one, it's okay. I personally like Maldraxxus the most, but that's personal. But I think I think they've certainly taken a step in the right direction. The issue is the gameplay is still boring as dirt, but story gameplay or story content being very boring gameplay-wise has been a thing in WoW for a fairly long time now. Ever since really Wrath the Lich King, Blizzard has basically turned questing, any kind of questing really, into a boring affair because you don't have any risks, you don't have any real challenges, and even if you do fail, you can easily recover, and that's the problem. Blizzard used to be really good at balancing a good gameplay, compelling gameplay that was interesting to go through, with a solid narrative. That's what made StarCraft 1 work, that's what made Warcraft 3 work, that's what made other games as well work, but that's no longer the case with World of Warcraft. Hell, even with World of Warcraft, you had the same kind of thing, like vanilla at least, with the Nyxia questline and the implications in Elwyn Forest, Westfall, Redridge. You no longer have compelling gameplay associated with the story content. We haven't had that for a while now. This has been an issue for many years now, and it's something I wish they would fix, but probably not. But either way, like, if that was it, however, if this was all there was to say about Shadowlands, it would be in a fairly solid state. I mean, sure, the open world stuff is still boring and grindy, and farming anima is atrocious. Dealing with the Maw and Torghast, having to deal with that, having to farm that, not great. Many things that aren't great. Some things that are disappointing, like Torghast, could have had a lot of potential. I think the gameplay there could have been very compelling if there was a good reward structure. But overall, I would say Shadowlands would be in a pretty solid state, if not for one major issue: the community. So the issue with the community is the way the game is set up right now. People would say, oh, it's the player base that's responsible for that. The player base plays the game dependent on how the game is set up. And we can see with like older versions of the game, be a private server or classic, how people can have a good solid community if there is incentive to do so, which doesn't exist really in Shadowlands. I would say it's very beneficial for you personally to play in a guild, but the problem is the game doesn't give you any real incentive to do so. You level up on your own, you quest on your own, you do dungeons really on your own, you queue in a dungeon, you get with a bunch of random people, you smash through the dungeon while leveling, no challenge, no effort, fairly brainless. Not really compelling gameplay either. And it's very easy, very quick, very, very fast. Unless you fail, and then people get very toxic. And then you get to max level, after you deal with all that boring gameplay, you get to max level, and then what do you have to do on max level? Oh, you have the Maw, you have Torghast, which, as I've stated before, disappointments. And then you have normal, heroic, dungeons, and raids. And the problem is, and then of course Mythic. And the thing is, this has been an issue in the game for a while, that there is no incentive whatsoever to really socialize with other people at all. There's no incentive to collaborate, to communicate, to deal with other people. In older versions of the game, doesn't matter if you're talking about Vanilla or Burn Crusade or even Wrath to an extent, there was some incentive in socializing with other people and talking with other people and playing together with other people. Because, say for instance, you would get to like 20, you would be in a 20 zone, and then you'd meet random people doing the same quest you're on, and you would just group up with them, or it would happen organically, and you do the quests that you need together, especially the group ones, then you'd go your separate ways, but then you might encounter some of those same people in a 30 zone, level 30 zones, 40 zone, and so on and so forth. And same thing with doing dungeons. You might do some dungeons with people at level 20, then you'd meet them to get again at level 30, 40, and so on. And that created a good, solid social experience, and it helped create a community. And that's just while leveling, let alone the things that were happening at max level in terms of pug raiding or how guilds were created and how people got together. So World of Warcraft as an MMO really used to incentivize people playing together. But over the years, those incentives have been destroyed. Part of it has been driven by the community, the creation of the Gear Score add-on, which then turned into iLevel, which then turned into Raider.io, has certainly contributed to that. But it's also the way the game works. The way the game works from a gameplay perspective. There's no reason whatsoever from a questing perspective to interact at all with other people. Even if you're on the same quest, you don't need to party up, you don't need to communicate, you just kill the same mobs and then move on. You don't care if you even see those people again, you don't care. But chances are you're not going to see them again because of the sharding system. And that's another problem. The sharding system, especially when Shadowlands was launched, made it so it was pretty rare to actually even see another person. I was playing on Kazakh, and still am playing on Kazakh, and it's a very densely populated server, and yet I was barely meeting anyone in the open world while leveling, or just doing quests in general. Even now where things have improved from that perspective, you don't really see that many people, and you certainly don't really interact with them, and you're not going to see the same people again and again because of all the shards that exist. And that is a problem. That's the first issue. Then you have Dungeon Finder, then you have LFR. You have all of these tools in the game, so you don't really have to bother interacting with people, even if it's something as basic as forming a group and joining together with other people to deal with a challenge. But then you have Mythic plus dungeons, or normal or heroic or even mythic Nafria. And people in the past have told me when I've mentioned this issue, people in the past, well, it's not really true for mythic plus dungeons or for raiding, proper raiding, not LFR. To which I reply, yes it is, because you have cross-realm plays, you have the ability to form groups very easily, to get groups together of people very easily, and to quit very easily, without any kind of penalty, without any issues. And you don't have to interact with other people. You don't have to ask someone how good they are. You have an add-on to tell you how good they are. You have eye level and a Raider IO to tell you how good supposedly someone is, along with an achievement. But that doesn't really work in practice. That's the problem, by the way. Not only do all these tools create an incentive for people to not socialize, to not interact with other people, to use a finder tool to just get random people in your group. But not only that, it doesn't actually work. I mean, this has been the problem with a gear score add-on from the very start. That gear score, even right now, eye level, is not a good indication of how competent someone is. And even if someone is competent, just because you get people with high eye level and high Raider IO, doesn't mean your group is actually going to succeed. And yet, the issue is people don't care. They don't care about team play. They don't care about communication. They don't care even about handling basic mechanics. It's rather shocking, actually, when you're doing high-level mythic dungeons, like 14, 15, 16 keys, you're doing those keys with people, and people are screwing up mechanics not only that are in mythic, but mechanics that have been there from heroic and even from normal. That's ridiculous. It just shows to me, and this is not a one-time thing. This happens over and over and over again. Barely any communication. You join a group or create your own group. Barely anyone talks with one another. And when they do talk, it's typically negative and toxic because there's been some level of fail. Even though you could have avoided that if you had communicated with other people, people don't care. People don't care. And if there is fail, people are more than willing to just dump a group on the first wipe in a raid or in a pug on the first failure. They just dump a group, find another one, move on, because it's very easy. It's very convenient. And there is no incentive whatsoever to do things differently, even if it's not the right way. Even if you could succeed in many of these cases with many of these groups, if people put in a minimal amount of effort. But the game doesn't create any incentive for people to do so at all. People assume, oh, if someone has a high eye level, has an achievement, has a good Raider IO, they know what they're doing. But that's not how dungeons work. That's not how raiding works. And overall, the tools that exist in game and outside of the game, Raider IO, the mythic dungeon tools, all that, they are creating incentives for people to be antisocial. In a game, in a massively multiplayer online game that should be all about creating a community, bring that community together, promoting teamwork. That's exactly the opposite of what's happening. And it's incredible to what degree we're talking about and how people are really being pushed to play like robots. An example I can give, a perfect example. I play a tank. In Nafria, most of the tanks that I've played with, most of the tanks I've seen in the groups I've been in, have failed consistently tank swaps. Take, for instance, Hungering Destroyer, the first boss of Castle Nafria. Not that hard, right? Compared to Huntsman, much easier overall. Hungering Destroyer. He has a buff he gains whenever he hits a tank. After a certain number of buffs, you should tank swap, right? Fairly simple. But a lot of the tanks, what they'll do, because we've been conditioned, really, by both the game and the tools we have outside of the game, what a lot of tanks will do is they'll only taunt when DBM tells them to. Now, DBM will only tell you to taunt when Overwhelm happens, which is an ability the boss uses. But here's the thing. There is a period of time in this boss fight when the boss is going to put circles on everyone in the raid. And if people are stacked together within each other's circles, they'll blow up, do a lot of damage. And the less HP you have, the bigger your circle, right? While these circles are happening, the boss will still hit the tank, will still gain stacks, but will not do Overwhelm. So what happens with the vast majority of the tanks that I've seen is they will not taunt. They will let the other person die instead of taunting to save their fellow tank. And they will not taunt, let the other tank die, then the raid might wipe unless you have a combat res. And this is not hard. This is very basic tanking stuff, right? Basic even by the level of vanilla. And yet people screw this up over and over. It doesn't matter if it's normal, heroic. People will mess this up. Now, I haven't raided Nafria Mythic yet. I probably will in a pug soon enough. But it is incredible to see this level of failure. And that's just one example. You see it across the board. You see it at Enerva. You see it at Huntsman. You see it even at Sun King, a fairly easy boss. You see it at Artificer with the seeds. Over and over and over and over again, people fail mechanics that are simple. And people don't care to listen. It feels even pointless to try and explain to people what they should do most of the time because people don't care to listen because they're playing in a bubble. But they're playing in a bubble where they're following a guide, maybe, in the best case scenario, or they're following DBM, and they don't care about it. We might as well be playing with a bunch of bots. And quite frankly, I feel a bunch of bots would do a better job and wouldn't be so insufferable to deal with. And this creates also a great deal of toxicity when inevitably people do wipe, and the community ends up being pretty bad. Now, some people would say, well, you can avoid all of that if you play in a guild, to which I reply, it's not quite so simple, and guilds are not necessarily the solution to everything. Sure, it helps. It helps make a better experience for you as a player when you have that social aspect that the guild does create. But joining guild, a raiding guild, can be tricky dependent on your class, dependent on your role. I play a tank. Many raiding guilds don't need tanks, don't care about it, and yet that's the role I want to play. And I found it very difficult for quite a while now, actually, on retail, to find any spot in a decent guild as a tank. The incentive for me to go through that when I can just pug it and clear the content in pugs just isn't there. That's also the problem. The game is pushing you. It's like you can clear the entire raiding content of the game. Maybe not on Mythic for a while, but you will eventually be able to clear the game content on Mythic if you push hard enough for it. With pugs, if you care for it. So what's the real reason joining guild? Oh, the social aspect. Okay. But that social aspect shouldn't be something you seek deliberately. The social aspect, the online experience of playing together with other people should be something the game does naturally instead of being against it. There's no reason to care at all about socializing while leveling, while doing dungeons, on normal, heroic, and even Mythic Plus. That's the problem. That's what ruins the game. That's the biggest issue in Shadowlands, far more so than any gameplay loot issues that might exist and do exist. It's not like the game is perfect in other departments, but this problem far outweighs anything else. Now, what could Blizzard do to fix it? Honestly, I don't know. I think the issue is caused because of convenience and because of certain about the tools that we have available to us to make things very easy, very convenient, very simple to find a group, leave a group, join another group. I think that's the problem. I don't think removing those tools would fix anything, really. Because I think once the damage is done, it's not like, oh, you can just flip a switch and everything will be solved. I don't think it's that simple. But I think this is an issue that Blizzard should look at and should consider fixes. Do they care? Honestly, I don't think they do. I think this is the problem. I don't think Blizzard sees it necessarily as an issue that they need to fix. That's kind of the bigger problem here. And maybe they should, because this is one of the things that does weigh down quite heavily on retail. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And stay tuned for more, everyone.